We're going to be talking more about the way the media is participating in this genocidal onslaught on Gaza. And a perfect segue from talking about protests to talking about the media is to show what happened to you, Medea, when you were protesting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So let's take a look at the protest, and then let's take a look at what happened to you. That's a protest in front of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Tell us what you were trying to do, Medea, when you were there.
Well, we got a room inside the hotel, and we unfurled a huge 40-foot banner, a Palestinian flag, but they didn't even know who it was who did it because we got out of the room quick enough. And then we were downstairs with a very tiny sign that said 100 members of the press killed in Gaza. And just holding up that sign, two of us, we got attacked, really brutally assaulted, thrown down the stairs, held on the ground, and then not only kicked out of the hotel, but signed something saying we were banned for 5 years to come back into that hotel. And this is all at a celebration of free speech, of journalism. And I also want to say that at the same time that we were there with that tiny little sign, there was a group of people with Stand With Ukraine signs and Ukraine flags that were right next to us. And of course, nothing happened to them.
Of course, right. And let's take a look at the footage of them roughing you up.
You better not be putting your hands on us. You better not be putting Ah! Help! Help! Ow! Ow! Ow!
You journalists, come over here. Hello! Journalists, come here. We're being assaulted for First Amendment right of free speech.
Help!
Help us, please.
Help!
Help!
Help us!
It's quite ironic because tonight was all about press freedom, and it seems like standing here with the sign is something that's a lot worse than 100 journalists in Gaza being killed.
And let's take a look at the injury that you posted.
That's from getting thrown down the stairs and grabbed on my leg as they picked me up.
Wow.
And I just do want to reiterate with what Bryce and Aidan have been saying, though, how minor this is compared to what happens to people in Gaza. And we don't want to make it about us. We want to make it about what is it that we're trying to bring up. And that is the 100 members of the press who've been murdered by the Israelis. And the fact that they could go in with their gowns, disregard the call by the journalists in Gaza to boycott that, to go in and have a wonderful meal while people are starving, and to laugh. It's all about laughing and making jokes about politics is so disgusting. And, that's a little bit of what we were trying to bring out. And the protests outside were really wonderful. People made the vests that say press and the names of the dead journalists and put them on the ground. And these people had to step over the vests as they were going into this fancy dinner. So I think it is a time to say that journalism, mainstream journalism, not journalism like you, Katie, is just, Aidan, what did you say? It's not only complicit, it's, what did you call it?
Partnership.
A partnership. Absolutely. I'm going to start using that from now on, not talk about complicity. You're right. It's a total partnership, and it is so sickening. And that evening to watch them having a good time together and laughing about what's happening both domestically and internationally was really quite disgusting.
Do you know if there were any jokes in the Correspondents' Dinner about the Gaza coverage?
No, there weren't jokes about it, but it was mentioned so briefly in passing by the head Correspondents Association. But in contrast, when they mentioned Evan, what's his name, Katie
Yeah,
Gosevich,
the from who's in Russia.
the
Yeah,
Wall Street
right.
Journal journalist
Oh,
who's being
yeah,
Yeah.
held in Russia. They all got up to applaud his family who was there, recognize them, and of course, not a word about someone like Shireen Abu Akleh or a mention of the names of any of the journalists who have been killed in Gaza.
Or Julian Assange, of course.
Or Julian Assange.
In fact, we have that clip.
The Wall Street Journal, they are counting, for Moscow correspondent Evan Gerskovich. 396 days since he was jailed in Russia. The U.S. government has designated Evan as wrongfully detained. And Evan's parents and his family are with us tonight.
Oh, not the stand up. Oh, no.
With you, always.
Yep.
We remember Austin Tice.
I wonder if Annette Schwartz got invited.
4,276 days, nearly 12 years since he was kidnapped in Syria. His mother Deborah is with us, and Mrs. Tice, we are with you. And Mr. President, again, we humbly ask that you do everything you can to bring them home.
She does mention the journalists in Gaza who have been killed, but she certainly doesn't mention who killed them. Right, right.
So
Yes,
it's
she
a
says,
standing
yeah.
ovation listing all these journalists, saying, "Thank you, President Biden. Please bring them home." And also, there are journalists in Gaza dying. And yes, now let's move on.
Well, yeah, and not only also are there journalists dying in Gaza, but also there's a journalist who you could free with the snap of your fingers with one phone call named Julian Assange. But yes, it's not. There's no connection between the United States government funding genocide and the deaths of journalists in Gaza. They make it seem like it's almost as kind of natural as they make hunger sound, as opposed to an inflicted famine. You know how they talk about starvation in Gaza to make it seem like it's a natural disaster? They do the same thing with the journalism.
And never a mention, Katie, of the word Israel throughout the whole evening.
It really highlights just how disgusting the national media is on this issue, and how they are able to manipulate and manufacture the images in order to make themselves seem like, defenders of freedom, bringers of truth, and, real principled people. Whereas in reality, those principles are out the door. I remember the CNN reporter who said that the Palestinians were going to employ something called the victim doctrine, which is to make themselves appear like victims to gain sympathy from the world. That's Joseph Goebbels would be proud of that. He'd be impressed.
Yeah, with that. Yeah.
Like it's truly evil, and everyone in that room supports a system that works like that.
Bryce, I don't know. I'm not sure if I agree with you. There's something I think you're not giving Joe Biden and this country credit for, and that is something called decency. Let's take a look at what Colin Jost, the host, MC of the White House Correspondents' Dinner, had to say about his dear grandfather and who he voted for and why.
Grandfather, a Staten Island firefighter, voted for you, Mr. President. He voted for you in the last election that he
Does he even know what
in.
state he's in?
He voted for you, and the reason that he voted for you is because you're a decent man.
This is the most insufferable thing I've ever seen.
Disgusting.
My grandpa voted for decency, and decency is why we're all here tonight. Decency is how we're able to be here tonight.
A lot of people don't know the lesson of, the media.
Decency is how we're able to make jokes about each other, and one of us doesn't go to prison after. We go to the Newsmax after party. And when you look at the levels of freedom throughout history and even around the world today, this is the exception. This freedom is incredibly rare.
When he says you can make a joke and not get into trouble, I couldn't help but think of Rafat al-Arir, the Palestinian poet, professor, mentor, who was killed by Israel who just lost, by the way, his daughter, son-in-law, and grandchild. But he was killed by Israel in December. He was targeted. He was killed in his sister's apartment building. It wasn't just a building. It was actually just that apartment. And a large reason that people were so upset at him, besides being an outspoken defender of Palestinian rights and critic of Israel and the United States, is because he made a joke that was making fun of Zionist hysteria and lying. I'm sure Colin Joss doesn't know about that, though.
Well, didn't he say he blamed Barry Weiss? Wasn't it Barry Weiss called him out?
He blamed, because Barry Weiss tweeted about this joke he made where he was making fun of this lie. I mean, it wasn't offensive because he wasn't making fun of a baby being dead. He was making fun of the claims about a baby being baked in an oven, which wasn't true. So the punchline of that joke was like Zionist hysteria who had lied about this. Yeah.
All right. What did he say? It was like, did they use baking soda?
Baking soda or something. Yeah.
And then his DMs were filled with such obscenities before he was killed.
Yeah.
It was one of the most beyond shameful things.
We actually found that Raffiat had commented on one of the Twitter accounts of a Zionist organizer on our campus, just calling him out for his nonsense. Wow. But, a lot of people here in the encampment, they don't necessarily, they didn't grow up reading and watching, Chomsky and manufacturing consent, and they don't know that the media does just straight up lie and invent things and manipulate and distort. But a lot of people in this encampment are learning this right now. In fact, there was a piece yesterday from our local Fox affiliate. They sent a guy down and, we interviewed with him, we talked with him. He was a perfectly normal, affable guy. And then we look at this segment, 1 minute and 30 seconds. And in it, there's a little point where he interviews like a Zionist rabbi on campus who hates us and has been, verbally abusing us for quite some time. And he says that, the rabbi is concerned that chants of intifada, which translate to death to Jews, like he just said that. It's an obvious lie. Either he's quoting the rabbi and he didn't bother checking it, or he thinks that intifada means death to Jews. In any case, that's just journalistic malpractice. Some people saw this and were, shocked. It was like, oh, how could the media say something like that? It's obviously not true. I even called the station just to correct them, but I don't think it'll have an effect because, they're not there to be fact checking and to speak truth to power or to, cover the social movements of our time. They're there because they want to make content, and they want to make content in a way that doesn't get them fired. And the best way to do that is to appeal to the dominant ideologies. And those dominant ideologies are, of course, uncritical, unconditional, unlimited support for Israel, and any criticism of Israel will be met with punishment, and it's anti-Semitic. That's the line that a lot of these media organizations watch. But to watch them lie like that, he even cited a state trooper who said that the reason for the violence that they used on the protesters was because they were worried that hate speech, quote unquote hate speech, might turn into violence. If anyone who was on the ground that day knows that not a word of that was said by the state troopers, and it's all recorded, it's all there, it's all easy to figure out. But the reason that they went into the camp was because there was a tent up, and that is against the policies that they were told to enforce. So they made up this pretext after the fact, the hate speech or violence after the fact. And of course, you have the state police trooper head cop.
I like pig, so trying to call them that.
Yeah. But whatever, he just made up this story. It was like, oh, yes, we saw all these hate speech and we were just worried about the safety of the nonsense. But it was reported uncritically by the media, and of course that affects public opinion and how people view these protests.
Right.
And of course, while they were saying that we're anti-Semitic, they put my face up there, it is me chanting. That's how they manipulate, and that's how they maintain this support for genocide.
Tell us about some of the worst media malpractice we've been seeing around this genocidal war.
Well, an interesting thing that happened was a New York Times reporter showed up to the encampment at Indiana University. And, the New York Times is god awful on this issue and has put out many pieces of misinformation designed to justify the genocide. And so, the New York Times reporter shows up again, another normal, nice, affable guy. He's not at the international desk. He's more of a Midwestern beat guy, but I don't know. I think the story has come out by now, so we'll see. But I haven't read it yet. But he was reporting on these encampments, talking about Palestine, talking about Gaza. And I asked him, I was like, well, you work for the New York Times. How do you view your paper's coverage of this issue? And he leans back, he goes, well, I think they've been pretty fair. I think they've been pretty fair. And I said, well, I mean, you heard about the scandal with that story, with the screams without words. And he said, oh, no, I don't know that story. I don't know the one. He had never heard of it. I was like, it was pretty big. The New York Times conducted an investigation into its own staff based on the leaks that were going to the media about the production of this story. And he's like, oh, well, send it to me. I'll check it out. So I sent it over to him, and he was around today, and he still hasn't read it, but it's astounding to me that this guy thought so highly of his paper that he worked for without even understanding the main criticisms of it, understanding what people were saying about it, understanding how they completely fabricated material. I mean, it's like a journalist covering Iraq war protests and saying that, oh, well, I think the New York Times coverage of the Iraq war has been, pretty fair and balanced, maybe a little rah-rah America, but, overall fair. Meanwhile, Judy Miller's publishing the most insane shit you've ever seen in your life. And, but again, it's another lesson. The way the media functions is not necessarily through a bunch of malicious individuals. It's through systems and structures, willful ignorance, and useful idiots. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this guy's malicious or even an idiot, but he certainly was ignorant about his paper's role in perpetuating the genocide. And hopefully he gives that piece a read and rethinks his position. But I don't know, Aidan, what have you been seeing?
Well, yeah, I mean, the reality is that, this Western journalism is it's a mouthpiece for empire. You know what I mean? Like to what you said, Bryce, the whole process of manufacturing consent. And I think it plays into the role of like university institutions too, like this intellectual obfuscation, like Palestinians somehow found somewhere, we don't know, passed away without referring to the explicit execution of children by the Israeli occupation forces, the explicit targeting, explicit, bombings and so on and so forth, in every aspect. And I just think about it too, and in the way students act on campus. And I have to believe a lot of the way they act is media. Some are obviously, especially from the Zionist camp, pro-genocide, but, there's these students who just go about their lives like nothing is going on. You know what I mean? Nothing. And that's in part because of the intensive, psychological, weaponry almost that Western journalism has set on, that people who are not necessarily engaged in and sort of like critical analyses or so on and so forth, and not put in a position where they need to, will plenty of them will not care because they're depraved, morally depraved, and racist and Zionist. But there's those who are just so, everything becomes so obfuscated. It just pacifies the masses.
Well, I have an example that just happened. If you want to see some New York Times bias, so here is something that was edited. They edited an abstract. So in an article says, universities face an urgent question: what makes a protest anti-Semitic? And the abstract originally said, pro-Palestine student activists, many of whom are Jewish, say their movement is anti-Zionist, but not anti-Semitic. It is not a distinction that everyone buys. All right. But now they changed it to pro-Palestinian student activists say their movement is anti-Zionist, but not anti-Semitic. It's not a distinction everyone buys. So they have to erase something saying that many of the pro-Palestine protesters are Jewish, because that undermines the narrative that the pro-Palestine protesters are anti-Semitic. So they have to remove that.
Yeah, that account, editing the Gray Lady, is
Yeah, it's
excellent.
great.
It,
Yeah,
it
it
is
really is. Yeah.
excellent for catching up stuff like this because it happens more than you think.
Yeah.
I think most people in journalism school are taught that if you make a change to your article
Right.
that affects the content, then you should probably tell your readers.
Yeah.
You should probably put an editor's note that says, this change was made for this reason at this time at this date, and we're sorry. We want to do better. They don't do that.
Yeah, it's
They
called
don't do
a
that.
stealth edit.
Stealth edit, and it happened in Gaza. It happened during, especially during the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
When there would be some embarrassing piece of information that would paint Ukraine in a negative light, it would be, there would be a headline that says like, Ukraine screws up bad, and then they would change it to Ukraine makes minor setback, or
Right.
obviously throwaway example, but that was the nature of the coverage, and that is the nature of how these media institutions work to engineer and maintain consent for their empire.
Right.
And it's not the journalists themselves who are doing this. The journalist, the editor, they might write a perfectly good, reasonable, balanced piece, but then once it gets to the higher ups, they might say, taking out that, changing the title, changing the abstract. Okay. And then by the time it gets published in the paper, the original journalist might not even recognize their work. But that's the media system we live in. It's a propaganda system, and everyone needs to learn some intellectual self-defense if they want to make sense of the world. And this Gaza issue is one of the, the more blatant examples of how this system works.
Someone at a protest said "Death to JEWS," and because of that, because of that, the protest was shut down and the protesters were arrested. This was at Northeastern in Boston, and the person who said it was a pro-Israel protester.
Yeah, you ever wonder why the Zionists on campus do so many false flags against themselves? Yeah. You were going to say something, Aidan.
I was going to say it's emblematic because when the Zionists were lining up cheering as the military police was unleashed, many of them performed, the Nazi salute, as a associating Palestinians with Nazis. And also we had seen and heard from our other organizers that the Proud Boys were also standing with them. So I think that's all you really need to know.
We keep talking about how much we want to focus on what's happening in Palestine, and of course we do, but I also think it's worth showing how the lengths to which the media goes to delegitimize these protests, because it's the same narrative that they're using against all Palestine supporters, which is that people support Palestine because they're hateful or anti-Semitic, or even now there's someone saying it's because it's popular, that's a cool thing to do, or because they don't have enough sex. I don't know if you saw that, but someone actually said that. I think it was Scott Galloway.
I saw that.